A first grader stood up in front of the class. They were all given the assignment of writing a short speech on what they wanted to be when they grew up. And so he stood up in front of his class and said, "I'm going to be a lion tamer, and I'm going to have lots of fierce lions. I'll walk into the cage and they'll roar and they'll roar and they'll..." Suddenly he stopped, realizing just what he was saying, and then added, "Of course, my mommy will be with me." I'm not sure how excited his mommy was to hear about that she was going to be in this cage of roaring lions with him. Now, why did he suddenly become, or decide that he wanted his mother with him? Because being surrounded by roaring lions can be a little scary. In fact, it can be downright dangerous. In 1898, two male lions stalked a railroad construction crew in Uganda, and the two lions are believed to have killed about 135 men. In 1932, a pride of lions went on a killing spree that left 1,500 men, women, and children dead. And so lions are dangerous. They don't ordinarily kill people, but if there's nothing else to eat, they will. Turn to Daniel chapter 6. I know you've been waiting to finish this story, just wondering what happened to Daniel after he got thrown into the lion's den last week. And so this week we will find out. You know, Daniel was one of three men, we're told, who served under the king, King Darius. And then under those three were 120 regional leaders. And when Darius saw that Daniel was just an outstanding leader, exceptional at his job, he decided to promote him. But when some of the other men found out that there was this chance that Daniel was going to be promoted, they devised a plan to get rid of Daniel. They convinced the king to sign a law that forbid everyone to pray to anyone except to the king, and that anyone caught breaking this law would be thrown into a den of lions. And the men settled on this plan because they knew of Daniel's faith in God, his steadfast commitment to God. And sure enough, even after hearing of the law and the consequences for breaking it, Daniel went home at his regular time, opened the window facing Jerusalem, knelt down, and began to pray in full view of anybody who happened to be watching. The men were waiting for it and then reported it to Daniel. You know, the king was immediately remorseful for making the law, but it was too late. There was nothing that could be done. Not even he, as the king, could stop it. And so that evening, Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. And we pick up with verse 17. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment brought to him, and he could not sleep. I'm reminded of the story when Jesus was placed in the tomb, right? They rolled a stone in front of it, had a seal. The stone was sealed. It's just a wax seal. It's not going to do a whole lot. I mean, it's not going to stop anybody from rolling the stone away. But it shows that seal, and the same was true with these seals on the stone in front of the lion's den. They were just there, the seals were there to show the authority that had placed the stone there. And so that if you move the stone, you're going to be in trouble from the king. You might even be killed for it. Now you can imagine the suspense of spending the night with some hungry lions. You know, Daniel, already apprehensive, but the night wasn't any easier for the king. We're told he couldn't eat, he didn't want any entertainment, and he wasn't able to sleep because he was concerned about Daniel. And even though he didn't see any way that Daniel could survive, he didn't give up hope. And we see that in his next actions that morning. Beginning with 19, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called out to Lion in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" You know, the guys who had Daniel thrown into the lion's den were certain that Daniel was not going to be able to survive, certain that he was dead. And yet here's the king calling out, "Hey, are you there? Did God save you? Preserve your life?" Verse 21, Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Now, I wonder how long it took Daniel to answer. You think it was immediate, or maybe he waited a few seconds, just to make him think? But Daniel answers. The tension builds, but he answers. He calls out to the king. Yes, indeed, God had saved him. God had sent an angel that closed the mouths of the hungry lions. We were living in Nashville when I was 3 to 6. We were there about 3 years. And I had been visiting family. I don't remember what the circumstances were, but I was in Georgia, and my aunt and uncle were taking me back to Nashville and driving in a Volkswagen Bug. And we were in Marietta, so just north of Atlanta, hadn't gotten too far, and a car pulled out in front of us. So we T-boned this car that had been pulled out. I remember my uncle sticking his arm out. You remember that habit? When there were no life belts. So he pulled our seat belts. He put his arm out, and that kept me from going forward and through the windshield, but it didn't keep my aunt from going through the windshield, or at least keep her head from going through the windshield. So her head went through, and it cut her neck. And the good thing is, the hospital was just 100 yards. And so she got to the hospital pretty quick, was in surgery pretty quick, and they said that just, a millimeter more, and it would have cut an artery, and she would have bled out. And she was pregnant with her son that they said she'd never get pregnant, right? And yet, miraculously, she got pregnant, and now she almost lost her life. And, it came that close. And then my cousin Teddy was born several months later. Now, how often do you hear stories kind of similar to that? Somebody's in an accident, and, if it only been just a fraction of an inch to the left or to the right, the story would have been completely different. We don't always think about God being there and intervening in that situation. But Daniel was sure that in this case, it was God. It was because God was at work that his life was spared. It was at God's direction that the lions didn't eat him. And after a night in the lion's den, Daniel was more than ready to give all the credit to God for his survival. Daniel also insisted that the reason that God rescued him was because God found that he was innocent, that he had done nothing wrong, nothing against the king or God. Verse 23, the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. We might attribute Daniel's survival to just natural causes, if we didn't believe in God. Maybe the lions had just been fed, so they weren't hungry, because if they're not hungry, they're not going to eat. There's no reason for them to attack Daniel if they're not hungry. Maybe before they had a chance, Daniel found a place to hide where they couldn't get to him. Right? We might be able to find some things that Daniel could have done to prevent the lions from getting to him. But Daniel says no. God sent an angel who shut the mouths of the lions. And King Darius understood that it was because of Daniel's faith in God. You remember when he called out to him, Daniel, did the God whom you have always served. Even the king who hadn't known Daniel very long understood that Daniel had always been faithful to God, had always served God. And so Daniel hadn't been clever enough to hide. It was simply God's doing. Verse 24, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. And we might understand why the men were thrown into the lion's den. You know, they were trying to kill Daniel. They'd made up this law that they knew they'd be able to use against him. They tricked the king, deceived him. But we understand why the men were thrown in. What about their wives and children? That doesn't seem quite fair. Well, the answer is this, that was the custom of the day. As cruel as it is, that was the custom. You know, if somebody killed someone else's father, well, then the son spent the rest of his life trying to get retribution. Well, this stopped that. You just kill the father and the son, then there's no one to come after you to get retribution. We see numerous stories in the Bible of that happening. They kill not just the father, but the children for that reason. And we see some stories where they don't kill the children, and sure enough, the children grow up and go after who killed the father. So it's cruel, but that's what happened. But this also shows us that indeed the lions were hungry. Now, they didn't ignore Daniel because they weren't hungry. They were hungry. They just waited for something else because God intervened. And so the hunger of the lions is illustrated by the fact that they jumped on them before they even were able to get to the ground. It was at least a quick death. Verse 25, then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. That's a pretty good testimony, is it not, to the greatness of God? Now, my question is, did he stop worshiping idols and only worship God from this point on? And the answer is, yeah, we're not told. We just don't know. And after the story of Nebuchadnezzar, we're kind of left wondering. I mean, he's a different person, so we shouldn't judge him by Nebuchadnezzar, but we remember what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He was given opportunity to worship God. On more than one occasion, he declared that God, the Lord, was God. You know, King Nebuchadnezzar saw the power of God and the wisdom that God gave Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When they were tested after their training, those four men had knowledge that far surpassed the knowledge of anyone else being tested. It was because of God. He saw the power of God when he threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and then saw not 3 but 4 men walking around. He called, they came out, and even their clothes did not smell like smoke. And at that time he declared, oh yeah, God is God. The Lord is God. He saw the power, that's chapter 3. In chapter 2, when he had that dream of the statue with the head of gold, that no one could tell him what his dream was, much less interpret, and Daniel did. And Daniel said, it's only because God told me. And he declared, oh yes, the Lord is God. He had all those occasions, and yet what did it take for him to turn to God? Well, when he was turned into an animal for 7 years and was out with the animals, eating grass, being wet by the dew of the earth, right? Finally, that was enough for him to turn to God. Was this enough to get the attention of King Darius? We don't know. Verse 28, so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, we don't know how much longer Daniel lived. All we're told is that God continued to bless him. He continued to be blessed, and he continued to serve the kings who were in charge. You're, of course, familiar with the story of the Magi who visited Joseph and Mary and Jesus in Bethlehem and bringing gifts. And we wonder, how did they know? They see the star. How did they know that what it represented, that this was the King of the Jews that had been born? How would they know that? How would they know to travel to Israel, to Jerusalem and to Bethlehem? Well, many believe it had to do with Daniel. It had to do with Daniel and the respect that he had, the knowledge that he taught these prophecies of the Old Testament concerning the Messiah. And so that almost 600 years later, they were prepared to, when this star appeared, they were prepared to go see and to see the baby that had been born because of Daniel and what he had done before he died. Now, the book of Daniel doesn't end with this chapter, but Daniel's story does. You know, the remaining six chapters, which I plan to start in a couple of weeks, contain the visions that Daniel received from God. Now, when you think of this incident in Daniel's life, and really just Daniel's life in general, what words would you use to describe Daniel? I think one word is upright. You know, Daniel did what was right. The men tried to find something and they couldn't. Daniel was a well-respected, highly honored man, and he was respected and honored before by several kings. However, his enemies believed he was just an old man. He wouldn't be too difficult to get rid of. All they needed to do was find a chink in his armor, and they could easily get rid of him. They were jealous of the respect he'd received from the king, the promotion that they heard might be coming. And so they figured that anyone who was in the government that long, right, had to be corrupt. And so they looked, trying to find dirt, but there wasn't any. No sexual immorality, no embezzlement, no betrayal, no palace intrigue. There were no rumors being spread about him. There was nothing. They couldn't touch Daniel because he was honest, he was blameless, he was upright. I think of another word that we might use to describe Daniel as is faithful. Daniel remained faithful to God throughout the whole ordeal. You know, we just see the strength of his faith, a strength that his enemies overlooked. Someone wrote an article about Stonewall Jackson, and they claimed that Jackson was a flawed general. It claimed that one of Jackson's weaknesses as a general was because of his faith in God. Yet someone else noted that Jackson neither smoked, drank, nor played cards, and sometimes he refused to march or fight on Sundays. And the article argued that a great general would never shy away from a fight, even if it was on a Sunday. It said any general worth his salt would have fought on whatever day they had to win. And so in the author's opinion, refusing to march or fight on Sundays was a major drawback. And yet, for a flawed general, Andrew Jackson did fairly well. You know, he won just about every fight he was in. In one conflict, he took on 3 separate Union armies totaling 64,000 men and beat them all. I'm pretty sure his faith was not his weakness. He probably had weaknesses, but it wasn't his faith. And Daniel's faith in God wasn't a weakness for him either. It was his strength. That Daniel's enemies tried to use his faith against him. They saw it as a weakness they could take advantage of, but it didn't work. You know, many people in the world do the same thing today. They look at people with faith and they think it's a weakness. They consider people of faith as weak, as ignorant, as vulnerable. They might laugh at those with faith, ridicule and make fun of them. And they do it because they see it as a weakness. But the Bible stories like this one about Daniel in the lion's den encourage us to keep our faith. It was his strength in God, that allowed him to do what was right even in the face of difficulty, even in the face of persecution. And because of that, he survived the hatred of his enemies. When talking about the heroes of the faith, the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews 11, says, and what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David, and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, Daniel, quenched the fury of the flames, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Did you catch that? Whose weakness was turned to strength. And that's what God told Paul as well. In 2 Corinthians, we read, Paul says, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. In Daniel, we don't see physical strength, but we see the strength of faith. He was strong to face his enemies, even those of lions, because of his faith. You know, like Daniel, like Paul, our strength comes from our faith in God. And it's out of our weaknesses that God is able to make us strong. It's in our weaknesses that God's strength, Paul says, is made perfect. One more word that we might think of when we talk about Daniel is courage. Courage. As C.S. Lewis defined courage this way, he noted that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. In fact, you would not need courage if you did not have fear. Someone else stated, courage does not consist in feeling no fear, but in conquering fear. He is the hero who, seeing the lions on either side, goes straight on because that is where his duty lies. National Geographic declared that lions are the best killers in the world. And they noted that something everyone has known for centuries, that lions are fierce and dangerous animals, and anyone willing to fight a lion is foolish or very courageous. Have you ever wondered, why did Darius have a den of lions? What was he doing with the lions? They're dangerous animals. I mean, if you've got the lions, isn't there always the chance that one's going to escape? And if it escapes, it's not going to be pretty. Why would you keep them around? Well, maybe it was for situations like this, right? That you had an enemy, you wanted to get rid of them. Hey, you don't straighten up, you know where you're going. Maybe that was it. One scholar did note that ancient Near Eastern kings loved to depict themselves in battle with lions, right? To show their courage, their bravery. And said, and this image, along with the lion figure more generally, became a common symbol for royalty. The lions fought by these kings were typically corralled and caged, not encountered in the wild. This means, of course, that these lions would have been kept somewhere. So they kept them for whatever purpose, for sport, for status. They loved to battle them just to prove their manhood. They believed their courage was shown in their ability to fight them. But Daniel wasn't a mighty warrior. Plus, as I already noted, he was in his late 70s, early 80s. You know, not the prime of his life. He's not ready to fight a lion. Now he's just a defenseless man, facing certain death. But in spite of that, Daniel was courageous. He was courageous. He showed himself to be a man of faith and courage. And when King Darius asked how he was doing, what did Daniel say? Verse 21, Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Darius wasn't able to sleep all night, but I wonder if it wasn't a different story for Daniel. I mean, Daniel was in the lion's den, but he also knew that God was with him. And I picture Daniel at perfect peace in the lion's den because God was with him, because God had sent an angel to close the mouths of the lions. He didn't have anything to worry about. In 2 Kings 19, the Bible tells us that one angel took out 185,000 enemy soldiers in a single night. Sounds like angels are fairly strong. I don't think an angel would have too much difficulty closing the mouths of those lions. Daniel was perfectly safe, and so I can imagine Daniel sleeping just as soundly as if he had been at home in his own bed. You know, Solomon made an interesting comment in Psalm 127 when he wrote, "For God grants sleep to those he loves." What does that mean? Well, it means we don't have to stay up worrying at night, worrying if we are God's children. God has us covered. And so we can close our eyes and sleep because we know who holds tomorrow. You know, it's been said that we can't always predict the outcome with God, but we can trust God with the outcome. We can't predict what God's going to do in our lives, what God's going to allow into our lives, but we can trust God with the outcome. Because God is with us, and he's promised to use all things for our good, for his glory. And that's what Daniel did. Daniel slept because he knew he wasn't in danger. God was with him. He was like that first grader in that cage with roaring lions. He was going to be fine. Why? Because his mother was going to be right there beside him. So he wasn't going to worry about it. And so if God is with us, we have nothing to be afraid of either. That's what Moses told the Israelites before they entered the promised land. Deuteronomy 31. I know I read this recently. He said, "Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you." God would not leave or forsake Daniel because Daniel had refused to leave or forsake God. Verse 10, going back to our passage in Daniel 6, we read that when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, which made it illegal to pray to the Lord, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Daniel knew about the law outlawing prayer to the Lord. And in spite of the law, Daniel deliberately went right up to his room, deliberately opened the window, deliberately knelt in front of it, and prayed for everyone to see. He was boldly declaring that he loved God too much to dishonor him by turning away from the Lord in fear of what others might do. He made it clear to anyone who cared to look that he would pray to God. He would remain faithful no matter what the cost. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside of your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown him before my Father in heaven." And so we should never be afraid to stand up for God before others. Because God does notice. He's watching. And if we have enough faith to put him first in a world that is hostile to our faith, God will stand up with us. I'll end with a story of faith and courage. Just over 500 years ago, a Roman Catholic priest named Martin Luther nailed a challenge to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. For several years, Luther had struggled with doubts, struggled with shame and the guilt of his sins, and he had done everything the Roman Catholic Church had told him to do in order to receive forgiveness. He did penance, he fasted, he prayed in sackcloth and ashes. He even went so far as to kiss the steps that led up to the Pope's throne in Rome. I don't know what that was supposed to do, but he did everything he was told to do. But no matter what he did, he didn't find relief. He never felt like he had been forgiven. And so finally, he did something crazy. He started reading the Bible. What does the Bible say about this? He looked to the scriptures to see if there was anything he could find. And it was there that Luther discovered the forgiveness and hope. It was not in what he did, but in what Christ did for him. But it also led him to question many of the Catholic Church's teachings. The selling of forgiveness or indulgences. You could buy forgiveness on Tuesday for a sin that you didn't plan to commit until Friday. The selling of church offices. You could buy a position in the church for your child if you had enough money, and then you didn't have to worry about your child. They'd have a job for the rest of their lives. He eventually began to question the authority of the Pope. Those discoveries prompted him to write out 95 problems, questions. He wasn't trying to start a problem. He just wanted to discuss these. We need to look at these. That something's not right. And so he nailed those to the doors. But the Pope wasn't very happy about that. He was dragged to Rome, held on trial, and told he needed to recant. He said, "Well, let me pray about it. Give me overnight to pray about it." And so he was granted 24 hours, and the next day they brought him out, and he attempted to make a defense, but he was told simply, "Don't make a defense, just answer the question. Are you gonna change your mind on this or not?" And he said that he could not go against his conscience. He said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Because of what he believed was in the Bible. Because he believed the Bible. And shortly thereafter, he was kidnapped by a friend who took him back to Germany and kept him, the Pope, from taking his life. Luther stood up for God, again, because of his faith in the Bible. You know, as I stated earlier, it's believed that because Daniel knelt and prayed, that several magi, 500 years later, went and visited Jesus. You never know the impact of your life. When you live a life that is upright, faithful, and courageous for God, you never know who's watching and the impact your example will have on others. Let's pray. We thank you for the life of Daniel, for his faithfulness to you. Lord, that even in the face of persecution, facing death, he did what he knew was right. Lord, we pray that we would always live faithfully for you, that we might be an example to the world around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.